Okay, let's see how long our battery lasts today. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is cut this in half. We've already got our mark. Just brace it against the side of the miter box, make sure it's a right angle cut. With the razor saw, a lot of times what you want to do, especially when you're braced against this back wall, is do most of your cutting or apply most of the downforce on the draw, not so much on the push. You know, sometimes these are referred to as a draw knife. It's the way it's serrated. The teeth are cut at an angle this way, so it does its best cutting on the back, on the pull, on the draw. So this is either a draw knife, razor saw, razor knife. I've heard it called all those things. That's what it is. Anyway, so now we have a nice clean cut. We have two equal-sized pieces of balsa for our prop links. And we're done with the razor saw for now. Should not be needing that again. I'm going to put the hub back on the engine just so that it doesn't get lost. Alright, so we just want to trace one of these, or this, on each one of these blanks. Get it right down to the bottom here. So we can know where we're cutting and sanding to when we start work. It's okay if you go off the edge there. Just put the line where the material is actually going to be taken away. We'll be rounding, ever so slightly rounding these sides here in the middle of the blade, but on this particular propeller, these are relatively straight lines just here in the center. The blade gets rather comes to a parallel shape here in reality, but it will be rounded slightly by sanding. We just want to make sure we have the major portions of the blade highlighted. Now in this case, it doesn't matter which way the template is oriented. The shaping of the blade, when we begin hollowing and shaping our blade, that'll determine, I don't know what will determine. The blades are going to be identical to each other. They're mounted on opposite sides of the hub, which gives them their proper orientation. It's not like one has to be carved one way and one has to be carved the other way. They're carved identically to each other and then just mounted on here in opposition. So in other words, I don't have to make a mirror image of this, a flipped one or the other. They'll be identical, and then because they're mounted opposed on the hub, that gives them their proper relative shape to each other. And then I'll provide incidence when I glue them on. In other words, the blades don't go on straight and flat. There's a bit of a twist. It's an air screw. So actually this will be this one tilted slightly outward at the leading edge, and this one again also outward at the leading edge. And because they're opposed to each other on the hub, that gives them an opposition appearance. If that makes sense. I don't even know if that makes sense. Just never mind. Trust me, he said. Alright, so now we're just going to pull off some of the material outside of our line. We don't want to go right to the line. We're going to sand to the line because that gives us much greater control. So we'll cut just outside of the line by just under a 1/16 of an inch, maybe by 1/32. In other words, we're eliminating some of the sanding work that we're going to be doing, but we're not carving exactly. We're not using the blade to get us to exactly where we want. We're using it to get us close. I found that if I can just reduce the amount of sanding that I'm going to do, I come out ahead of the game. If I leave all this on here and just do everything by sanding, I'm wasting a lot of time sanding stuff I could have just sliced. So we slice it, but we don't go right to the line. We want the sandpaper, the sanding block, to do the lion's share of shaping. That's true when I'm doing anything. The wingtips, you know, we do minimal carving, mostly sanding. And I refer to using the sanding block with coarse sandpaper. Anytime I'm using the coarse sandpaper, that's what I call carving. I'm carving, but with sandpaper. And the only time I'm going to use a really rough grit is when I'm really shaving a lot of material, doing heavy shaping. Okay, so we've got our two, now we have our two blanks, our two rough prop blanks. So the next step here, because propeller blades, they don't remain thick like this all the way down. So there's going to be tapering, which I'll do with heavy grit sandpaper. And for that I'll use the big block, which has repositioned itself somewhere out of my view. In other words, it's lost. The big sanding block, and what I'll do is I'll sand this, we'll drive the tip more or less down onto the sandpaper, get our wedge determination there, get this tapering towards the propeller tip. It'll be sanded equally in this direction and against the face. You really want this blade, this taper, to come from both sides. You don't want, in other words, I don't want to just taper the back down. I want to taper a little bit off of both. All right, we want to keep kind of a center line here, if that makes sense. We want a center line here in addition to our center line here. But it's just a rough datum. It's not, I'm not concerned about being more or less one way or the other. If anything, I probably want to take just a little more off the back than off the front. All right, so I imagine then what I mean to do here is the first thing will be to shape to this line, because I'm going to be erasing that line when I start sanding the face of this. So we're going to sand now to shape to the shape of our outline, and then we'll begin the tapering process, face and back of our blade. After that we'll start rounding our leading edge. We'll start shaping this edge more like a wing leading edge, and then we'll begin to rough sand the knife edge into the back side of our blade. And once that's done, we'll begin to shape the face of the blade, give it that radius on the face of it, and then we'll begin to hollow out the back of the blade, which I described before by using sandpaper wrapped around this dowel, and we'll sand this way on the back of our blade to get that cutout, to get that hollow. Okay, so first thing was to sand to this shape using a relatively coarse grit. For this I'll use, I think this is 100 grit. 100 grit's fine. So we're going to sand to this shape around our propeller tips. And we'll sand on the bottom. Our attachment point. Remember, we're not going to touch that cut at all. We're not going to do anything with that saw cut. We want that to remain clean and straight and flat. As you saw from the photograph in an earlier video where I took showed you what the blade that I'm looking at off of my monitor, my computer monitor, you remember that blade comes to a pretty severe point. Those tips are very tight at the top. Also, it's a pretty skinny blade. It's not a real big striker. Like some of the early racing planes had this really wide sort of paddle at the bottom. So this is not that type of blade. It's not a paddle type blade at all. It's more of a rapier, more like a sword almost. A broadsword, but a sword. And so we want to keep that vision in mind. We want to hold it in our thoughts, in our head while we're doing the shaping. Because basically I found that whatever imagery I might have in my mind as I'm doing this, it's being conveyed right through my hands, my actions, if that makes sense. It's kind of a truth about working with your hands. So probably painters experience it all the time. An artist who's painting, you want to really have that image of what you're going for firmly in your head while your hands are doing their work. So that you have the intended result. It lends itself to having the intended result. Okay, anyway, it seems pretty basic, but when you say it out loud, it just seems to carry more weight. So now we've sanded to our outline here, and it's going to change slightly as we start rounding the leading edge and knife edging the trailing edge of our blade. We're going to be reducing that and causing a little bit of shift, and that reduction is okay, because what I did with the template was I made it a little bit broader than what we're actually going to be going for. This is the overall shape. We're going to be sanding into this a little bit. We're going to do our best to maintain the profile, but it is going to be reduced, and that reduction I expect through repetition and having done this and experience will get us down, will render us down to the actual shape that we're looking for, that we're going for here. Right? So anyway, this is our blank. This is the shape we wanted our blank to be, to begin. Right? So we'll make sure we're kind of doing both of these at the same time. Might as well. We'll just at least I want to at least do this phase on both of them. One of the things we want to check too is that we're not getting too small at the base here when we do this. See, we're still wider than our hub. And again, remember that's because we're going to be sanding into this profile. So we don't want to be already at our width at this point, because then we won't be able to touch this area while we're shaping, and that would lend itself to an odd looking blade. Okay, so we left it wider at the base at the outset, at our blank stage, because that gives us room to work, right? So as far as when I'm looking for accuracy on the blade, as important as that is, symmetry is more important. Anytime anything is manufactured, a series of propeller blades, for instance, in a factory, there are going to be variances. I mean, you're dealing with tight tolerances. You're using machine equipment. In 1930 something, a lot different technique and measuring and consistency would be found in production than today. So while I might come to a shape here that's actually very accurate, and that's important to me. But what's more important is that this one and this one are identical, or as close as I can get them to being identical. Okay, so that's where I'm going to put the emphasis. I'm telling you now. I'll tell everybody. I'll make a video and talk about it there if that's what it takes. But anyway, that's just me. You know, no lives were ever lost. Nobody died on an operating table because a carved propeller blade wasn't perfect. Right? So let's not be the first. Let's just live and accept the best we can do. It's an ongoing battle with that. We were just noticing another modeler was saying having the same issue. What's my decision point on whether I can accept or not, or have to rework something? You know, you're working along, and you're let's say you're working on the motor here, and you know, you're doing your job, you're doing your thing, and you're just not satisfied with the result. And you know, is it because it's not perfect? I don't know if I'm probably not explaining this right, but there's always a decision point. Is this good, or is this not good enough? Can I do better? Should I do better? Should I tear this apart now and start over? And you know, that decision comes at every phase when you're building. You know, this fuselage, this wing, this tail, this assembly, this whatever, and everybody kind of struggles with that. You know, I can see this, it's going to bother me, versus someone might notice that, or it just isn't right. It's not what I was expecting, or whatever. And so it's a battle, you know, for us. We all go through it, you know. And my thing is, I guess my solution is I'll usually draw a line. I'll say, you know, before I start a project, I'm willing to go up to a maximum of three rework decisions. In other words, you know, if I'm working on the cockpit and I don't like something,